Hello, everyone. I'm going to get started here. My apologies for the delay. But what is an event without challenges? Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. My name is Jason Oliver Chang. I'm Associate Professor of History and Asian American Studies here at UConn, and I'm also Director of the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute. It's the academic unit that provides minors in India Studies, Asian American Studies, and Asian Studies, and is the kind of academic home for this kind of work. One of the hallmark events of the Institute is this Day of Remembrance. So every February, we gather to observe the Japanese American Incarceration Day of Remembrance, which I'm going to explain a little bit about that past. But before I do that, I need to thank a bunch of folks who have helped support this event and made this possible. Really largely thanks to the American Studies program, the History Department, the Dodd Center, the Human Rights Institute, El Instituto, and the Asian American Cultural Center. And for this support, we're immensely grateful. So on this day, in 1942, 75 days after the Japanese government bombed Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the military to conduct a forced removal and incarceration of more than 120,000 Japanese American citizens and Japanese immigrants from Western states across Latin America. The administration and the media drew from decades of anti-Japanese agitation and nearly a century of anti-Asian politics to label all Japanese Americans as an enemy race, racially motivated against the United States. The president's executive order was based upon the claim that Japanese Americans could not be trusted as perpetual foreigners inextricably linked to the military operations of the Japanese government. Without a single instance of sabotage, spying, or attack, thousands of families were made to suffer the violence and trauma of forced removal to remote concentration camps. The camps operated until 1946. 32 years later, Japanese Americans began organizing for reparations from the experience of this tragedy, inaugurating the practice of this Day of Remembrance. Every year, people organized to remember what happened to Japanese Americans, aiming to reverse the constitutionality of 9066. In 1988, President Reagan signed into law the formal redress of incarcerated Japanese Americans. And every year, we observe the Day of Remembrance because that was not enough. The camps live on in the intergenerational trauma of this event. It is not enough because there are more camps now. More than 70,000 migrant children, mostly from Latin America, were held by U.S. authorities last year. And more camps are being built to incarcerate more children this year. So I could think of no better way to speak to this complicated and difficult time than by inviting the talented writer and poet Brandon Shimoda to speak with us on this occasion. Brandon and I talked about what we could do with this space of this event and hatched this following plan. We wanted to do something that connected with lived experience, with a cultural legacy, and contemporary connections. We also wanted to show what interdisciplinary Asian American studies looks like. So we've brought together history, music, poetry, creative writing for this event. So first we will feature the reading of first-person testimonies by UConn senior Kayla Claiborne and political science PhD candidate Carol Gray. Also, she is the graduate instructor for our course 3531, The Japanese American Experience in World War II. Second, UConn's very own Kodama Taiko drumming group will perform for us, played by Zachary Mangold, Ava Kovlakas, Yasmin Taib, Brandon Ho, Vaughn Nangel, and Jackie Kloos. And lastly, Mr. Shimoda will read remarks prepared for this event, followed by some questions and comments. I'll introduce him now so I can get out of the way of this program. Mr. Shimoda is the author of numerous books of poetry and nonfiction. One central theme in this body of work is documenting his personal journey to excavate the history of incarcerated family members. There are many things which make Brandon's work unique. One thing stood out to me in his writings. It is that he shows us a method of historical thinking, what I might call speculative recollection, which makes the act of investigating disavowed histories a way to account for the human experience of racialization, which does not leave direct evidence. The significance of this technique is that such a journey necessarily connects you to its historical precedents and living legacies. It does this because the tools of racialization, like the camp, are old and dirty from use and reuse. So in the process of this multi-act event, we'll pause briefly between acts, which will be an opportune time to show your appreciation for our performers with applause. So that will be a time where we'll also be switching gears up here. But I want to, some people like to wait for applause at the end. I think it's totally appropriate to applaud for them after their performance while we set up for the next act. So to begin with, please join me in welcoming our performers. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Carol Gray, and I'm happy to welcome Kayla Claiborne, who is going to be reading an excerpt from Citizen 13660 by Mine Okubo. And Kayla is an East Asian Studies and Political Science major, and she's going to be headed to the abroad program in Japan at Sophia University that's run by UConn. And after graduation, she's interested in teaching English in Japan through the Japanese Exchange Teaching Program. And thank you, Kayla.
Good afternoon. I will be reading an excerpt from Citizen 16330. On warm days, it was unbearable in the stalls and barracks. The stench of manure returned with the heat, and this in turn brought back the horseflies. Most of the people remained outdoors on such days, and usually I did too. But there were times when I kept on working inside. Later, by the order of the medical authorities, all windows in the stalls were hinged so that they could be opened. The warping of the lumber left cracks in the floor, half an inch to an inch wide. Through the cracks, the tall grass came up. There were 2 center-wide inspections at Tranferan. The first, on the instructions of the Wartime Civil Control Administration in San Francisco, was entirely routine. It was made because the evacuees' baggage had not been thoroughly checked upon arrival. Potentially dangerous tools such as saws and chisels were confiscated, and Japanese phonograph records and literature were also taken away. Bibles and religious books were returned later. The second inspection was conducted by the Army. At this time, a still more thorough search was made. Each section was placed under guard while the search was conducted. because of the quarantine sign on my door, they almost passed me by. We inferred from the inspections that we would soon be moved to a permanent center fairly soon. Rumors about the site and the date of the conditions of the relocation were always arising in Tranfran to make a brief stir amongst the residents. But in August, relocation assumed the shape of reality in the minds of all. Post-strung with chicken wire appeared on the northeast center corner of the camp near the back gate by the railroad siding. The entire area around the gate, including the laundry building and the toilets, were completely fenced off, leaving one section open. Although there was no official word on specific details, residents were putting two and two together and arriving at the same conclusion, that we were going to a relocation center in Utah. With about 500 evacuees and 50 military police on board, the train started on its way at exactly 7:45 p.m. Our last glimpse of Tranfran Assembly Center brought smiles. Some of the residents had climbed to the stable roofs and were holding aloft huge Bon Voyage signs, as others waved goodbye to us. The trip was a nightmare that lasted 2 nights and a day. The train creaked with age, it was covered with dust, and the gas lights failed to function properly as we traveled in complete darkness most of the night, reminding me of the blackout trains in Europe. All shades were drawn, and we were not allowed to look outside the windows. For many, it was the first long journey. They were both excited and sad to leave California and the Bay region. To this day, for many of them, the world was as large as San Francisco to Tanforan to Topaz.
Those pictures that you just saw were drawn by the author herself. They did not allow cameras in the internment camps, and so she documented what she saw by making sketches everywhere she went, so those were done by her. The next reading is from a book called Farewell to Manzanar, and this is by Jean Wakasuki Houston. A Common Master Plan. I don't remember what we ate that first morning. I know we stood for half an hour in cutting wind waiting to get our food. Then we took it back to the cubicle and ate huddled around the stove. Inside, it was warmer than when we left because Woody was already making good his promise to Mama, tacking up some ends of lath he'd found, stuffing rolled paper around the doorframe. The trouble was he had almost nothing to work with. Beyond this temporary weather stripping, there was little else he could do. Months went by. In fact, before our home changed much at all from what it was on the day we moved in, bare floors, blanket partitions, one bulb in each compartment dangling from a roof beam, and open ceilings overhead so the mischievous boys like Ray and Kayo could climb up in the rafters and peek at anyone's life. The simple truth was the camp was no more ready for us when we got there than we were ready for it. We had only the dimmest ideas of what to expect. Most of the families, like us, had moved out from Southern California with as much luggage as each person could carry. Some old men left Los Angeles wearing Hawaiian shirts and Panama hats and stepped off the bus at an altitude of 4,000 feet with nothing available but sagebrush and tar paper to stop the April winds pouring down off the backside of the Sierras. The War Department was in charge of all the camps at this point. They began to issue military surplus from the First World War, olive drab knit caps, earmuffs, pea coats, canvas leggings. Later on, sewing machines were shipped in, and one barrack was turned into a clothes factory. An old seamstress took a pea coat of mine, tore the lining out, opened and flattened the sleeves, added a collar, put armholes in, and handed me back a beautiful cape. By fall, dozens of seamstresses were working full-time, transforming thousands of these army clothes into capes, slacks, and stylish clothes. But until the factory got going and packages from friends outside began to fill out our wardrobes, warmth was more important than style. I couldn't help laughing at Mama walking around in army earmuffs and a pair of wide-cuffed khaki-colored wool trousers, several sizes too big for her. Japanese are smaller generally than Caucasians, and almost all of these clothes were oversized. They flopped, they dangled, they hung. It seems comical looking back. We were a band of Charlie Chaplins marooned in the California desert. But at the time, it was pure chaos. That's the only way to describe it. The evacuation had been so hurriedly planned, the camps so hastily thrown together, nothing was completed when we got there, and almost nothing worked. I was continually sick with stomach cramps and diarrhea. At first, it was the shots they gave us for typhoid in very heavy doses and in assembly line fashion. Swab, jab, swab. Move along now. Swab, jab, swab. Keep it moving. That knocked all of us younger kids down at once with fevers and vomiting. By the way, she was 7 years old when she was in the camp. Later, it was the food that made us sick, young and old alike. The kitchens were too small and badly ventilated. Food would spoil from being left out too long. That summer, when the heat got fierce, it would spoil faster. The refrigeration kept breaking down. The cooks, in many cases, had never cooked before. Each block had to provide its own volunteers. Some were lucky and had a professional or two in their midst. But the first chef in our block had been a gardener all his life and suddenly found himself preparing 3 meals a day for 250 people. The Manzanar runs became a condition of life, and you only hoped that when you rushed to the latrine, one would be in working order. That first morning, on our way to the chow line, Mama and I tried to use the women's latrine in our block. The smell of it spoiled what little appetite we had. Outside, men were working in open trench with up to their knees in muck, a common sight in the months to come. Inside, the floor was covered with excrement, and all 12 bowls were erupting like a row of tiny volcanoes. This is the author in her later years. And click the next one, please. This is what's left of the internment camp now. I've been to see the Topaz internment camp. Very similar. Everything's gone like it never existed. Next, please. There are commemorations that are held in that area, and there are protests with Japanese Americans on the forefront protesting discrimination against Muslims and other people. And here are some pictures of that. And the last reading will be done by Kayla, and it's of a draft resistor. The author here is Frank Seishi Emi, and he was one of the founders of a draft resistor movement in the camp that he was in, which was the Heart Mountain internment camp.
Today, I would like, can you guys hear me? Just making sure. Today, I would like to dispel the myth that we were all quiet Americans. That after being stripped of our constitutional rights by our own government, removed from our houses, businesses, and jobs, then interned in concentration camps located in godforsaken areas of the deserts and prairies, we all went quietly and sheep-like into segregated combat units to become cannon fodder to gain acceptance of the great white father. On September 10th, 1942, our entire family, my wife, my 9-month-old daughter, parents, 2 sisters and brothers, all went to Heart Mountain Concentration Camp in northern Wyoming via the Pomona Assembly Center, where we had been for about 4 months. We arrived at Heart Mountain in the middle of the violent dust storm. You could not see further than 10 or 15 feet. The first winter was unpleasantly memorable. It was the coldest winter in Wyoming history. We We were attired in Southern California clothings. None of us even had a top coat. The barracks did not get an inner wall of Celotex until the middle of December. We had our first snowfall in late September. I mention this to give you an idea of the harsh environment which we were thrust. My first involvement in the resistance movement, if you will, began with the introduction of the so-called loyalty questionnaire. The questionnaire contained 30 questions. Two of the questions, number 27 and 28, were controversial. Number 27 asked, "Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States wherever ordered?" If you answered yes, then the implication was that you were going to be volunteering for the Army. Number 28 read, "Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any and all attacks by foreign or domestic forces? Up to that point, no problem. And forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any foreign government, power, or organization." If a Nisei answered yes, he or she was admitting previously sworn allegiance to the emperor. And in the case of an Issei, or first-generation immigrant, if they answered yes, they would become persons without a country. They were prevented from becoming citizens of the country because of racist naturalization laws at the time in the United States. After studying the questionnaire for some time with my younger brother Art, I finally came up with a response to the questions. To both questions, I was going to answer, "Under the present conditions and circumstances, I am unable to answer these questions." I felt that many would be confused about how to answer these questions. With the help of my brother, we hand-printed copies of my answer on sheets of paper and posted them around the mess hall doors and other public places throughout the camp, with the notion that these were suggested answers to those two questions. That was my initial activity in the grassroots movement. About this time, a Nisei pastor made a speech at a gathering urging people to cooperate with the registration program and to answer in the affirmative to both two questions. After he finished speaking, another gentleman, Kiyoshi Okamoto, got up and spoke. Okamoto, a soil test engineer from Hawaii, was about 50 years old. He talked about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the abridgment of all of our rights by the government without due process. He said that as Americans, we should stand up for our rights instead of following a policy of appeasement. The man was well versed in the Constitution. His speech was an inspiration to some of us who had similar feelings. During this period, he referred to himself as the Fair Play Committee of One. After the meeting, several of us got together with Okamoto and had a long talk. This resulted in the formation of the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee as an organization. Some of us wanted the Fair Play Committee to take a more positive stand on the draft issue. As an organization committed to fight for civil rights, we felt that we had to challenge the legality of the draft law as applied to the concentration camps. After a heated session of the steering committee, we members who wanted to test the law prevailed. There were about 400 in attendance at the next public meeting. We presented our resolution to the members, and it was unanimously endorsed. With the endorsement of the members, we printed and distributed the third and final bulletin at the next meeting. Based on the contents of this bulletin, the 7 most visible members of the Fair Play Committee were indicted and arrested by the FBI a short time later.
Just to close out that chapter, you see here a photo of the largest mass trial ever held in Wyoming. That was June 26, 1944. 63 draft resistors were found guilty and sentenced to 3 years in federal penitentiary. Within a month, the other 7 organizers were indicted. 6 other organizers were indicted, including the author of this text. And he was then sentenced to 4 years in federal penitentiary. Next slide, please. This is Frank Seishi Emi in later years. His sentence ended up getting reduced to 18 months in federal prison. And he died in 2010 and was really much celebrated and looked at as a hero in later life.
Thank you, Kayla and Carol. I should say this is also an example of the excellent work that our graduate instructors and adjuncts do at this university that don't often get recognized enough, and that this work that they're doing in this class is fantastic. And as you saw with the kind of reading that you guys are doing is wonderful. Thank you for that. And now I want to welcome up Yukon Taiko, Kodama Taiko. Hello, thank you so much to Jason for, where is it? Thank you, Jason, for having us. We are Yukon Kodama Taiko. This piece for you is called Hiryu Sandai Gaichi, and we hope you enjoy it. Hiryu Sandai Gaichi.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ava. I'm Vice President of Yukon Kodama Taiko. And the song we just played, Hiryu Sandan Gaeshi, is played in a style of taiko known as kumi daiko, which is a special ensemble style drumming, and was actually first introduced to the United States in 1968 with the founding of the San Francisco Taiko Dojo. What we're going to play next is called Miyake. But first I want to talk to you a bit about the relationship of taiko to Japanese Americans and their identity. For many in the post-war period, they felt that their identity was a burden. Displaying their culture, speaking their language, could get you harassed, jailed, and no one would bat an eye. So why pass such a burden on to your children? How do you keep the younger generation, the sansei, safe when just speaking Japanese, practicing martial arts would get you labeled as a traitor? So the Japanese arts, the Japanese language were repressed and suppressed. So what happens when a group such as the performers of the San Francisco Taiko Dojo, when someone, an immigrant, a Japanese immigrant to the United States, such as Seiichi Tanaka, is performing taiko, something that's allowed, something that's out there, that gets you noticed. For many Japanese Americans of the younger generations who saw taiko, it could be a way for them to once again be loud about their identity. I want to let you know about an organization called Suru for Solidarity. I'm going to read a bit the description from their website. Suru meaning crane, referring to the folded paper cranes. Suru for Solidarity is a nonviolent, direct action project of Japanese American social justice advocates working to end detention sites and support frontline immigrant and refugee communities that are being targeted by racist, inhumane immigration policies. We stand on the moral authority of Japanese Americans who suffered the atrocities and legacies of U.S. concentration camps during World War II, and we say, stop repeating history. On June 6th, a pilgrimage is being made to the Washington Monument, organized by Suru for Solidarity. It's been awarded a grant by the Taiko Community Alliance, and 100 taiko players from across the US will be joining and drumming. We're really proud of that. We're honored to be a part of this event, and we're glad that taiko can have a role in activism for Japanese Americans. Okay. Let this never happen again.
Thank you so much, Ava. So as Ava mentioned, the Suru for Solidarity program is one we're extremely proud of, and we are lucky enough today to welcome Karen Young, who is out of Boston. Karen, I know it's, yeah, Karen, give a little wave. So Karen Young is one of the artists in residence in Boston, and she does a lot of work to try and make sure Asian Americans really have power and are more represented in our society. She's going to be talking again on Saturday as part of our panel program for a conference we're organizing, and that's actually going to be one of the topics that's going to be touched on. So if this interests you a little bit, Karen is here today, and then she'll be talking again on Saturday. We just wanted to encourage people to come look at that, learn more about the program, see what activism is going on. And thank you again, Ava, for all of that. Now we will be performing Miyake for you. Thank you. just really moved right now. Having a hard time putting my words together. But this is amazing to see the kind of commitment and talent and skill of our students and the work that they're doing. So I think one thing I hope will happen is, as Brandon is reading the first-person testimonies, the performances you just heard, Brandon's words, they will somehow produce an alchemy that didn't already exist. So I hope as we complete this program that we can make those kinds of connections too across the different performances. All right. So I'm going to stop talking and let Brandon speak with you.
Yeah, that was amazing. My heart is racing. I mean, I'm nervous, but also just from the drumming. I feel like, that was really incredible. And talking about the ways that Taiko can be incorporated into activism is really a profound thing to think about. I also want to reiterate that Suru for Solidarity meeting in June, slated to be the biggest congregation of Japanese Americans potentially in history, if not since World War II. So thank you so much to Jason. Thank you so much to the Institute and everyone here and the Cultural Center. I know there were quite a few organizations that went. Can everybody hear me? I think I might be a little bit louder if I stand further away from the microphone, actually. Is it projecting at all? All the different organizations that coalesced to put this program together. I was thinking about how many people here have attended a Day of Remembrance, a February 19th Day of Remembrance before. So maybe 10 people. I was thinking about how these Days of Remembrance are becoming more, popular is not the right word, but more people seem to be attending them every year. And that's really both inspiring and empowering and deeply troubling, right? To think that as we move further away from this history, more people feel the need, the compulsion to connect with it. So that's underlying that reality or that reality underlies what I'm going to be sharing today. So what I'm going to share is going to move through a variety of registers. It's going to be autobiographical, it's going to be historical, there's going to be some criticism, there's going to be storytelling. So please bear with me. These are all things that I'm thinking about currently, so everything I'm going to be sharing is kind of like thinking in progress. So I feel like to risk that kind of vulnerability is really the only way I can stand up in front of people. And there's also a slideshow. I want to begin this talk by asking a question, the answer for which might seem obvious, but which is not obvious, at least not to me. On this Day of Remembrance, February 19th of this year and every year, what is it that we are remembering? I want to take this opportunity to ask this question directly of everyone here. On this Day of Remembrance, February 19th, 2020, what is it that you are remembering? So I know that as people were coming in, you might have received an index card. So I thought we could spend, if not, does anybody need one? Just maybe raise your hand and somebody could maybe distribute. So I just wanted to spend 5 minutes in your own thoughts and in your own words, what is it that you are remembering on this day of remembrance? It can be as personal as you want or need it to be, or as communal as you need it to be. So 5 minutes, and then we'll return to these at the end of my talk. I begin with this question because I feel that with each passing year, the nature of the invitation as well as the imperative to remember changes or must change. And not because the distance between ourselves and the mass incarceration of Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans during World War II becomes greater, but because, given the cumulative and unrelenting force of American injustice, it is constantly being revealed that there is no distance at all. If Japanese American incarceration is an event on which we look back, it is also, as proven by the imperative to remember, a condition that continues to proliferate. So then the invitation to remember becomes an invitation to be vigilant and honest about the ways in which Japanese American incarceration has not ended. When I say that it has not ended, what I mean is that its myriad effects have not ended, have not been fully and finally realized, nor have the people suffering the myriad effects achieved a full and final vanquishing of those effects. And when I say it has not ended, what I mean is that the system in which Japanese American incarceration was made possible has not ended, and the components that were forged out of that system have not ended, but are still operational and in force. Christina Sharp, in her book In the Wake on Blackness and Being, asks the following fundamental question in relation to the unfolding afterlives of slavery. The question is also an incisive response to the invitation to remember. How do we memorialize an event that is still ongoing? The cover image of this book is a sculpture by Cornelia Parker, and it's pieces of charred wood recovered from a shipwreck. Today, February 19th, 2020, as Jason told us, is the 78th anniversary of the signing of Executive Order 9066, February 19th, 1942, which authorized the forced removal of Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans from the West Coast and along part of the US-Mexico border, and their mass incarceration in detention centers, then in concentration camps in remote deserts and swamps across the US. Here are some basic facts about Executive Order 9066. It was signed by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat. It is 5 relatively short paragraphs in length. It authorizes the Secretary of War, who we now refer to as the Secretary of Defense, to designate military areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. It authorizes the Secretary of War to provide for those excluded people transportation, food, and shelter. And it states as justification for these actions that, quote, the successful prosecution of the war requires every possible protection against espionage and sabotage. In other words, the justification for forcibly removing any or all persons is national security, and the justification for national security is war. But, as Sora Han, professor of criminology and law at UC Irvine, reminds us, the United States is not at war. The United States is war. As I was looking at this photo of FDR, I became fascinated by the ring on his pinky. I wondered what that was about. And then the person standing behind him, I became even more obsessed by these hands, which started to look like some kind of sea creature. If there was a zoom on this thing, I would just keep zooming in until it took over the room. Here are some more basic facts about Executive Order 9066. Nowhere does it mention a single instance of espionage or sabotage against which it was ordering protection. Nowhere does it mention removal or forced removal or incarceration or internment or detention centers or concentration camps or internment camps. And nowhere does it mention the Japanese or Japanese immigrants or Japanese Americans. Executive Order 9066 is, as is most racist legislation, perfectly efficient in balancing specificity and generality. So what do I mean when I say that the system in which Japanese American incarceration was made possible has not ended? And what do I mean when I say that the components that were forged out of that system are still operational and in force? Here, in no particular order, are just some of the components that made Japanese American incarceration not only possible, but inevitable, and in the light of which Pearl Harbor should be understood not as the advent, but as the perfect alibi. The question is whether or not we recognize these as being relics from the past or permanent features in 2020 of the insatiable state of exception. Anti-immigrant propaganda, restrictions to legal immigration. A current example of this would be the so-called public charge regulations on visas and green cards, which the Supreme Court recently allowed the Trump administration. Racial profiling, warrantless raids and warrantless surveillance, the maintenance of surveillance databases, media complicity in fomenting anxiety and rage, perpetual and arbitrary tests of allegiance, forced submission to the ideologies and behaviors of national security citizenship, forms of social control derived from penitentiaries, plantations, and native reservations, the occupation of indigenous land, the dispossession and theft of property, exploitative labor, a constitution so reliant upon interpretation and so unequally applied as to be completely subjective, and of course, mass incarceration. If these things made Japanese American incarceration possible, and these things still exist, in some cases more forcefully, and until recently, with greater subtlety than they did in 1942, then how can we say that Japanese American incarceration has ended? We can say it by turning Japanese American into an adjective. Because in the decades since Japanese American incarceration, the United States has deconstructed the apparatus of Japanese American incarceration and has resurrected and continues to resurrect it across the entire spectrum of American existence. This litany of components is a catalog of democracy in action, at least the version of democracy by which American power has abided and with which American power has brutalized the world. There is nothing subtle about any of the weapons included in this ruthless and brutal catalog, but there is and was everything obtuse and subliminal in their deployment, and even more so given the ways that the United States, from the machinations of the government to the rage of the landowners and business